Good evening. Today I will cover the Unit 5 of Biopsychology, that is BPCH, um, BPCC Biopsychology, and the unit is 5, that is the hemispheric specialization of mainly the brain lateralization part. Um, So I have already covered the central nervous system, that is all the functions of the central nervous system, with the peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system, somatic nervous system, and the functions of all the parts of brain, as well as the structure and functions of neuron and spinal cord. So, today, this hemispheric specialization of this brain lateralization chapter, that is Unit 5, mainly the main portion is the left and the right hemisphere, how the functions are done, and what led to the development of the theory of this cerebral dominance, and also the difference between the left and the right hemispheres, cutting the corpus callosum, that is the split brain, and the Myers and the Sperry's groundbreaking experiment, and the split brains in human. And the last part of this unit, it covers the methods to study the brain lateralization. So there are three methods mentioned here. They are the sodium amytal test, then dichotic listening test, and the functional brain imaging. So, uh, mm, first, let me start with about like what is the brain lateralization mean, and how this right hemisphere and the left hemisphere actually functions, and what are the separate or the differences between them, etc. So, you must aware that majority of the people in the world are right handed, so they are known as the dextrals. But there are there are some people like who are also left handed, and they are known as centrals. So the right handed people, they are known as dextrals, whereas the left handed people are known as the sinstrals. And there is also a tiny fraction of people who can use their both right and left hands simultaneously to do any type of work like writing, etc. And they are known as the ambidextra. So how this happen, uh, let us see. The left and the right hemispheres, it is a general conception that a human being has one brain, but anatomically, our brain consists of two structures. So, if we separate, or if we just see that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, these two, we can easily separate our brain into these two parts. Now, these hemispheres have contralateral, that is the opposite connections with the rest of the body. That means the left hemisphere of the cerebral cortex is connected to the right side of the body, while the right hemisphere is connected to the left side of the body. Now, these hemispheres have separate from each other, but they do exchange information through a number of channels. So, one of these channels is known as corpus callosum, that is a set of axons that connect the left to the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, other channels of communication between these two hemispheres include the anterior commissure, the hippocampal commissure, the massa commissure, the posterior commissure, and lastly the optic chasm. So, these hemispheres are similar in structure but not similar in functions, because the left hemisphere possesses superiority in certain functions like over the right hemisphere. Now, similarly, the right hemisphere is specialized over the left in other cognitive functions. Now, these differences in the specialization of function of hemispheres is known as hemispheric specialization, or it is also known as lateralization of function. Now, these two functions may be due to some theories, or the result of this uh, different of functions of the right and the left hemisphere. This left hemisphere was often termed as the dominant hemisphere, because there are some specific dominant functions, whereas the right hemisphere was called as the minor hemisphere due to the functional differences. Now, what led to the development of the theory of cerebral dominance? Now, this before moving further, it is important to discuss those events that led to the development of the theory of cerebral dominance. Now, one can attribute the development of this theory, like cerebral dominance, to two prominent names. Number one, Paul Broca and Hugo Carl Lippmann. So, in 1864, the French physician and anatomist as well as anthropologist Paul Broca, he reported that all his aphasia patients had damage to their inferior prefrontal cortex of the left hemisphere. So this area is known um, as the Broca's area, and this made him conclude that the left hemisphere is responsible for language ability. Now, similarly, Hugo Carl Lippmann in the early 19s, he reported that patients of apraxia also had damage on the left hemisphere. Now, what are these aphasia and apraxia mean? Now, aphasia is the inability to produce or comprehend speech due to brain injury, whereas apraxia is an inability to perform voluntary physical movement due to the brain injury. Now, then, what are the main differences between this left and the right hemispheres? Now, in this, we have already discussed about that famous report of Broca, and similarly, the right hemisphere is specialized over the left in other cognitive functions. So, what is cognitive functions? That we already know, that is learning, memory, perception, emotions, etc. Now, however, this lateralization of function is statistical rather than absolute. That means that there is a relative functional difference between the left and the right hemisphere, and one hemisphere possesses comparatively more specialization. Now, let's see what are the main differences of this left hemisphere dominance whereas the right hemisphere dominance. Number one is the vision. Now, the vision under this left hemisphere dominance, it includes the words, the letters. Then the right hemisphere dominance, it includes the faces, the geometric patterns, the emotional expression, etc. Now, after vision comes the audition. So, the left hemisphere dominance is a language or sounds, whereas the right hemisphere dominance, it includes the faces, the geometric patterns, the non-language sounds, the music, any rhythm, etc. And the touch, the third one, the left hemisphere dominance, there is no such left hemisphere dominance in touch. But the right hemisphere dominance, it is present because the tactile patterns and the braille, that is the two important part of this right hemisphere dominance on touch. Now the important part after touch is the movement. So here the left hemisphere dominance is on complex movement, um, ipsilateral movement, etc. Whereas the right hemisphere dominance, it includes the movement in spatial patterns. After movement comes the memory. Now the left hemisphere dominance, it includes the number one, the verbal memory, number two, the finding meaning in memories, etc. Whereas the right hemisphere dominance, it includes the non-verbal memory, the perceptual aspects of memories, etc. The language, that is the most important thing where the two dominance is present, the left hemisphere dominance as well as the right hemisphere dominance, like the speech, reading, writing, doing any arithmetic, etc. Where the right hemisphere dominance, it is due to the emotional content part. Then the spatial ability, again the right hemisphere dominance, that is the mental rotation of shapes, that means geometrical shapes or the directions or distances, etc. Now this is all about, okay, let me tell you one thing, the ipsilateral movement, it is opposite to contralateral, that is the ipsilateral. Now it means on the same side, that means it is a well established fact that our hemispheres are contralaterally connected to our body parts. Now in 1996, Harland and Harrington, they first observed in an MRI study, that is fMRI study, that complex cognitive movement performed by one hand led to usual contralateral activation along with ipsilateral activation of the hemisphere. Now the spatial ability is already known, that in which direction or the perception of the space or any type of distance or geometrical shapes, etc. Then the emotional ability, that means expressions of any emotions, maybe negative emotion or maybe positive emotion, that it depends on the situation. And the musical ability is also using the dichotic listening task, like Kimura in 1964, he reported that our right hemispheres is superior in musical ability. So there were many other studies on patients with damage in the right hemisphere are consistent with the findings of Kimura, that is, right hemisphere lessons disrupts the musical ability of such patients. Now, differences in memory, that means there were some studies which have suggested that both of our hemispheres have the memory ability. That means the right hemisphere as well as the left hemisphere. Maybe it differs into the verbal memory or the non-verbal memory, etc. Now, cutting the corpus callosum or the split brain. So it is a very important question for the examination. Now, what will happen if there is any damage of the to the corpus callosum region, or if we cut it down for epilepsy surgery? So before 1950, the corpus callosum was one of a great mystery for neuroscientists. That means corpus callosum is made up of 200 million axons and is located in the middle of the two hemispheres. Now, due to its enormous size and central position, scientists always believe that it has some major role to play. But what are the functions of this region? So, studies on several laboratory animals like monkeys, rats, cats, and people with damaged corpus callosum did not suggest anything. But later on, Myers and Sperry's groundbreaking experiment was a well known experiment because this conception about this corpus callosum changed in 1953 when Myers and Sperry conducted a groundbreaking experiment on cats. And for their experiment, they took four groups of cats uh, for their experiment, and they took number one group was cats with severe corpus callosum, that is a control group. Another control group, that is the cats with severe optic chiasm. Number three, the key experimental group, that is the cats with severe corpus callosum and optic chiasm both, whereas cats with intact brain or no damage to their brain control group. Now, corpus callosum and the optic chiasm are the only two routes by which visual information can travel from one hemisphere to the another, to another hemisphere. So the researchers cut completely through them for their key experimental group. Now, this experiment was conducted in two phases. The first phase was all cats were trained for a lever press pattern discrimination task with a patch on one eye. So, cats of all groups, including the key experimental group, learned this task without any difficulty. Now, this suggests that single hemisphere can also learn any task without any difficulty. So, this suggests that this um, single hemisphere can also learn any task independently and as rapidly as two hemispheres can learn together. In the second phase of the experiment, the patch was switched to cat's other eye and were again given the same discrimination task to perform. So it was found that the switching of the patch to other eye had no effect on the performance of the cats except for key experimental group. So This transferring of the patch had a devastating effect on key experimental group cats, and their performance immediately dropped down and they had to relearn the task like a beginner. This result made Meyer and Sperry conclude that our hemispheres have the capability to act as a separate brain, and role of the corpus callosum is to transfer the information across hemispheres. So this was the famous experiment. Now, based on this experiment, following two theoretical points may be concluded. What are they? Number one, the role of corpus callosum is to transmit the information from one hemisphere to the another. Number two, if corpus callosum is completely cut down or damaged, each hemisphere can work independently as if they are carrying two separate brains in one skull. Now, this split brain in humans, uh, let's see, like the question is, does severing of this corpus callosum affect the human behavior? So, in order to treat the critical cases of epilepsy, uh, there were some experiments, and where Vogel and Bogen started conducting the commissurotomy, that is the operation of cutting through a band of muscles or nerve fibers. Now, these operations proved remarkably uh, effective, as many epilepsy patients never experienced another major convulsion or epilepsy attack. So, people who have undergone such surgery are known as split brain people. Now, in order to understand the effect of this commissurotomy on human behavior, Sperry and Gazzaniga, they conducted the experiments on the split brain patients. The basic premise of their methodology was similar to Sperry's previous experiment on laboratory where the experiment was done on cats. Now, limiting information to one hemisphere only. Now, the split brain patients were asked to fix their gaze at the center of a display screen. The stimulus was presented on either left or right side of the screen just for zero point 0.1 second. This short duration of stimuli presentation was enough for perceiving it, but not enough for patients to make any eye movement. Further, some fine textual and motor activities were given to perform by each hand under a ledge. Now, this procedure made sure that information about stimuli would not transmit to ipsilateral hemisphere. So, the conclusion was, just like the laboratory animals, the split brain patients also have two independent hemispheres, having their own consciousness, capabilities, and memories. And number two, contrary to the hemispheres of laboratory animals, hemispheres of split brain patients are not equal in their abilities. Now, the research that where the hemispheres of split brain patients can work independently and have unequal abilities. So, in their study of Gazzaniga and Sperry presented either visual or tactual stimuli to either side of their hemispheres. Now, when a picture of a spoon was presented on the right visual field or the spoon was placed in the patient's right hand, the left hemisphere gets activated and he or she does the following things. What are the things? Number one, the patient simply tells the name of the object, that is spoon, and number two, picks out the correct object kept under the ledge with the right hand. So, these two steps taken by the patients indicate that their left hemisphere had received and stored the information. Whereas the second phase of the study, it shows or a picture of the spoon was presented on the left visual field or the spoon itself was placed in the patient's left hand. Now, this activates the right hemisphere. However, the responses given by patients were completely different. Now, these were the important experiments of split brain, and after this, uh, what are the methods to study the brain lateralization? Now, about 2 centuries ago, the phrenology, a pseudoscience, studied brain uh, protrusion of the skull uh, and associated it with a particular behavioral characteristics. Then Franz Joseph Gall and Johann Gaspar Spurgeon contributed to the system of phrenology. Now, based on their observations of hundreds of human skulls, they proposed that there were 27 skull protrusions on the scalp, and each protrusion was related to a particular behavior. Now, with the advancement of technology, human brain mapping is done by technique like fMRI as well as combining other techniques to identify the brain regions associated with actual mechanisms that are basic to a cognitive process. So, there are broadly 5 methods to study the cerebral lateralization. What are they? The unilateral lesson study of split brain patients, the sodium amytal test, the dichotic listening test, and the functional brain imaging. Now, out of these fives, uh, the main two methods are discussed here. Uh, not two, but 3 methods are discussed here. Now, the first one is the sodium amytal test. The sodium amytal test is also known as the WADA test, the name after a neurologist, June A. WADA, or intracarotid sodium amobarbital procedure, that is ISAP. Now, this test is often performed prior to any neurosurgery, especially where epileptic patient, where the surgery is necessary in order to determine which side of the hemisphere is responsible responsible for language and memory functions. So, in a standard sodium amytal test, a small amount of sodium amytal or sodium amobarbital is injected into the right or the left internal carotid artery. Now, sodium amytal works as anesthesia and for few minutes suspend the activity of that hemisphere on which the injection is given. Now, this allows the neurosurgeons to assess the capabilities of other hemispheres using various procedures and tests. Now, the next important method is the dichotic listening test. What is that test? Now, initially, the dichotic listening test was used to investigate the phenomenon of selective attention, and since it is a non-invasive test, it is quite popular among neuroscientists for studying cerebral lateralization. Now, in this method, using earphone, participants are presented with two different auditory stimuli to right and the left ear simultaneously. That means one by one or one at a time. Now, Kimura in 2011 simultaneously presented different pairs of digits in both ears of participants and asked to report all the digits. He found that majority of the participants were able to reproduce digits correctly presented to their right ear than the left ear. So, thus suggesting that for the majority of participants, their left hemispheres was specialized for only language. Now, the third important method is the functional brain imaging. Now, brain imaging techniques offer researchers and neuroscientists to study the structure and the functioning of our brain without operating it. Now, there are many brain imaging techniques that we have already learned in the first chapter of this biopsychology or first unit. That means the techniques like fMRI, CT scan, PET scan, EEG, MEG, etc. Now, studies investigating cerebral lateralization have used fMRI and PET scan extensively. Now, while a volunteer engages in some activities, such as, say, for example, reading, the activity of the brain is monitored by positron emission tomography, that is the PET, or the functional magnetic resonance, that is small f capital MRI. This was studied by the research work of Pennell and Barnes in 2017. That is, it is a recent work or recent research. So, in this unit we have already covered our hemispheres, which are they have collateral or the opposite connections with the rest of the body, whereas which part is the dominant, and say for example the left hemisphere of the cerebral cortex is connected to the right hemisphere of the body, while the right hemisphere is connected to the left side of the body, just opposite. And there were various studies on the left hemispheric, where we have found that the left hemispheric region possesses the superiority or the dominance in function over the right hemisphere. And similarly, the right hemisphere is specialized over left in other cognitive functions. And this difference in the specialization of function of hemisphere is known as the hemispheric specialization or lateralization of function. Then the famous Paul Broca and Hugo Carl Lippmann, they have played a major role in the development of this idea of cerebral lateralization. And then in 1953, Myers and Sperry, they have conducted a groundbreaking experiments on cats. The results of their experiment suggest that both of our hemispheres can act as separate brains. And number two, the role of the corpus callosum is to transfer the information across hemispheres. Then comes the famous Perry Gazzaniga. They have conducted the experiments on split brain patients to understand the effect of this commissuriatomy of human behavior. So the five methods are used to study the cerebral lateralization or unilateral lessons. The studies of the split brain patients, the sodium amytal test, the dichotic listening test, and the functional brain imaging. So this is all about this brain lateralization and everything about the functions of left hemispheric hemisphere of the brain as well as the right hemisphere of the brain, and what are the differences as well as the important theories or experiments, the theories based on these experiments, whereas the methods of this the three important methods are mentioned here among the five important methods. Uh, so today up to this, uh, this is a very important unit, and often question comes from this unit about the differences of the left hemisphere and the right hemispheres, or explain any one method of this lateralization, and what is split brain experiment, etc. This type of important questions are very common from this unit. So thank you for listening.